Hello, everybody. Sorry for the few seconds of delay. I was setting up the other device. All right. So, happy Saturday to everybody. Once again, we are going to carry on with the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. One second. Gotta get my water off the floor. Okay. All right. Without further ado, let us go. Chapter 5. Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz was not a pleasant sight, even for other Vogons. His highly domed nose rose high above a small, piggy forehead. His dark green, rubbery skin was thick enough for him to play the game of Vogon civil service politics and play it well, and waterproof enough for him to survive indefinitely at sea depths of down to 1,000 feet with no ill effects. Not that he ever went swimming, of course. His busy schedule would not allow it. He was the way he was because billions of years ago, when the Vogons had first crawled out of the sluggish primeval seas of Vogsphere and had lain panting and heaving on the planet's virgin shores, when the first rays of the bright young Vogsal sun had shone across them that morning, it was as if the forces of evolution had simply given up on them then and there, and had turned away in disgust and written them off as an ugly and unfortunate mistake. They never evolved again. They should never have survived. The fact that they did is some kind of tribute to the thick-willed, slug-brained stubbornness of these creatures. Evolution, they said to themselves? Who needs it? And what nature refused to do for them, they simply did without, until such time as they were able to rectify the gross anatomical inconveniences with surgery. Meanwhile, the natural forces on the planet Vogsphere had been working overtime to make up for their earlier blunder. They brought forth scintillating, jeweled, scuttling crabs, which the Vogons ate, smashing their shells with iron mallets. Tall, aspiring trees of breathtaking slenderness and color, which the Vogons cut down and burnt the crab meat with. Elegant gazelle-like creatures with silken coats and dewy eyes, which the Vogons would catch and sit on. They were no use as transport because their backs would snap instantly, but the Vogons sat on them anyway. Thus the planet Vogsphere whiled away the unhappy millennia until the Vogons suddenly discovered the principles of interstellar travel. Within a few very short Vogue years, every last Vogon had migrated to the Megabrantis cluster, the political hub of the galaxy, and now formed the immensely powerful backbone of the galactic civil service. They have attempted to acquire learning, they have attempted to acquire style and social graces, but in most respects the modern Vogon is little different from his primitive forebears. Every year they import 27,000 scintillating, jeweled, scuttling crabs from their native planet and while away a happy, drunken night, smashing them to bits with iron mallets. Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz was a fairly typical Vogon in that he was thoroughly vile. Also, he did not like hitchhikers. Somewhere, in a small dark cabin, buried deep in the intestines of Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz's flagship, a small match flared nervously. The owner of the match was not a Vogon, but he knew all about them and he was right to be nervous. His name was Ford Prefect. Ford Prefect's original name is only pronounceable in an obscure Betelgeusian dialect, now virtually extinct since the great collapsing Hrung disaster of galactic sidereal year 03758, which wiped out all of the old Praxabeetle communities on Betelgeuse 7. Ford's father was the only man on the entire planet to survive the great collapsing Hrung disaster, by an extraordinary coincidence that he was never able satisfactorily to explain. The whole episode is shrouded in deep mystery. In fact, no one ever even knew what a Hrung was, nor why it had chosen to collapse on Betelgeuse 7 particularly. Ford's father, magnanimously waving aside the clouds of suspicion that had inevitably settled around him, came to live on Betelgeuse 5, where he both fathered and uncled Ford. In memory of his now dead race, he christened him in the ancient Praxabeetle tongue. Because Ford never learned to say his original name, his father eventually died of shame, which is still a terminal disease in some parts of the galaxy. The other kids at school nicknamed him Ix, which, in the language of Betelgeuse 5, translates as boy who is not able satisfactorily to explain what a hrung is, nor why it should choose to collapse on Betelgeuse 7. He looked about the cabin but could see very little. Strange, monstrous shadows loomed and leaped with the tiny, flickering flame, but all was quiet. He breathed a silent thank you to the Dentraces. The Dentraces are an unruly tribe of gourmands, a wild but pleasant bunch, whom the Vogons had recently taken to employing as catering staff on their long-haul fleets, on the strict understanding that they keep themselves very much to themselves. This suited the Dentraces fine, because they loved Vogon money, which is one of the hardest currencies in space, but loathed the Vogons themselves. The only sort of Vogon a Dentraci liked to see was an annoyed Vogon. It was because of this tiny piece of information that Ford Prefect was not now a whiff of hydrogen, ozone, and carbon monoxide. He heard a slight groan. By the light of the match, he saw a heavy shape moving slightly on the floor. Quickly, he shook the match out, reached in his pocket, found what he was looking for, and took it out. He ripped it open and shook it. He crouched on the floor. The shape moved again. Ford Prefect said, "I bought some peanuts." Arthur Dent moved, and groaned again, muttering incoherently. "Here, have some," urged Ford, shaking the packet again. "If you've never been through a matter-transference beam before, you've probably lost some salt and protein. The beer you had should have cushioned your system a bit." "Ugh," said Arthur Dent. He opened his eyes. "It's dark," he said. "Yes," said Ford Prefect, "it's dark." "No light," said Arthur Dent. "Dark. No light." One of the things Ford Prefect had always found hardest to understand about humans was their habit of continually stating and repeating the very, very obvious, as in, "It's a nice day," or "You're very tall," or "Oh dear, you seem to have fallen down a 30-foot well. Are you all right?" At first, Ford had formed a theory to account for this strange behavior. If human beings don't keep exercising their lips, he thought, their mouths probably seize up. After a few months' consideration and observation, he abandoned this theory in favor of a new one. If they don't keep on exercising their lips, he thought, their brains start working. After a while, he abandoned this one as well as being obstructively cynical, and decided he quite liked human beings after all, but he always remained desperately worried about the terrible number of things they didn't know about. "Yes," he agreed with Arthur. "No light." He helped Arthur to some peanuts. "How do you feel?" he asked him. "Like a military academy," said Arthur. "Bits of me keep on passing out." Ford stared at him blankly in the darkness. "If I asked you where the hell we were," said Arthur weakly, "would I regret it?" Ford stood up. "We're safe," he said. "Oh, good," said Arthur. "We're in a small galley cabin," said Ford, "in one of the spaceships of the Vogon constructor fleet." "Ah," said Arthur. "This is obviously some strange usage of the word safe that I wasn't previously aware of." Ford struck another match to help him search for a light switch. Monstrous shadows leaped and loomed again. Arthur struggled to his feet and hugged himself apprehensively. Hideous alien shapes seemed to throng about him. The air was thick with musty smells, which sidled into his lungs without identifying themselves, and a low, irritating hum kept his brain from focusing. "How did we get here?" he asked, shivering slightly. "We hitched a lift," said Ford. "Excuse me," said Arthur. "Are you trying to tell me that we just stuck out our thumbs and some green, bug-eyed monster stuck his head out and said, 'Hi, fellas, hop right in. I can take you as far as the Basingstoke roundabout'?" "Well," said Ford, "the thumb's an electronic sub-ether signaling device. The roundabout's at Barnard's Star, 6 light-years away. But otherwise, that's more or less right. And the bug-eyed monster is green, yes." Fine, said Arthur. When can I go home? You can't, said Ford, and found the light switch. Shade your eyes, he said, and turned it on. Even Ford was surprised. Good grief, said Arthur. Is this really the interior of a flying saucer? Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz heaved his unpleasant green body round the control bridge. He always felt vaguely irritable after demolishing populated planets. He wished that someone would come and tell him that it was all wrong so that he could shout at them and feel better. He flopped as heavily as he could onto his control seat, in the hope that it would break and give him something to be genuinely angry about. But it only gave a complaining sort of creak. Go away! He shouted at a young Vogon guard who entered the bridge at that moment. The guard vanished immediately, feeling rather relieved. He was glad it wouldn't now be him who delivered the report they'd just received. The report was an official release, which said that a wonderful new form of spaceship drive was, at this moment, being unveiled at a government research base on Damagran, which would henceforth make all hyperspatial express routes unnecessary. Another door slid open, but this time the Vogon captain didn't shout, because it was the door from the galley quarters where the Dentrasis prepared his meals. A meal would be most welcome. A huge furry creature bounded through the door with his lunch tray. It was grinning like a maniac. Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz was delighted. He knew that when a Dentrasi looked that pleased with itself, there was something going on somewhere on the ship that he could get very angry indeed about. Ford and Arthur stared around them. Well, what do you think? Said Ford. It's a bit squalid, isn't it? Ford frowned at the grubby mattresses, unwashed cups, and unidentifiable bits of smelly alien underwear that lay around the cramped cabin. Well, this is a working ship, you see, said Ford. These are the Dentrasi's sleeping quarters. I thought you said they were called Vogons or something. Yes, said Ford. The Vogons run the ship. The Dentrasis are the cooks. They let us on board. I'm confused, said Arthur. Here, have a look at this, said Ford. He sat down on one of the mattresses and rummaged about in his satchel. Arthur prodded the mattress nervously and then sat on it himself. In fact, he had very little to be nervous about, because all mattresses grown in the swamps of Squarnchellis Zeta are very thoroughly killed and dried before being put to service. Very few have ever come to life again. Ford handed the book to Arthur. What is it? Asked Arthur. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's a sort of electronic book. It tells you everything you need to know about anything. That's its job. Arthur turned it over nervously in his hands. I like the cover, he said. Don't panic. It's the first helpful or intelligible thing anybody's said to me all day. I'll show you how it works, said Ford. He snatched it from Arthur, who was still holding it as if it were a 2-week dead lark, and pulled it out of its cover. You press this button here, you see, and the screen lights up, giving you the index. A screen, about 3 inches by 4, lit up, and characters began to flicker across the surface. You want to know about Vogon, so I entered that name. So. His fingers tapped some more keys. And there we are. The words Vogon Constructor Fleet flared in green across the screen. Ford pressed a large red button at the bottom of the screen, and words began to undulate across it. At the same time, the book began to speak the entry as well, in a still, quiet, measured voice. This is what the book said. Vogon Constructor Fleets. Here is what to do if you want to get a lift from a Vogon. Forget it. They are one of the most unpleasant races in the galaxy. Not actually evil, but bad-tempered, bureaucratic, officious, and callous. They wouldn't even lift a finger to save their own grandmothers from the ravenous bug-blatter beast of Trawl, without orders signed in triplicate, sent in, sent back, queried, lost, found, subjected to public inquiry, lost again, and finally buried in soft peat for 3 months and recycled as firelighters. The best way to get a drink out of a Vogon is to stick your finger down his throat. And the best way to irritate him is to feed his grandmother to the ravenous bug-blatter beast of Trawl. On no account allow a Vogon to read poetry at you. Arthur blinked at it. What a strange book. How did we get a lift, then? That's the point. It's out of date now, said Ford, sliding the book back into its cover. I'm doing the field research for the new revised edition, and one of the things I'll have to do is include a bit about how the Vogons now employ Dentrassi cooks, which gives us a rather useful little loophole. A pained expression crossed Arthur's face. But who are the Dentrassis? Great guys, said Ford. They're the best cooks and the best drinks mixers, and they don't give a wet slap about anything else. And they'll always help hitchhikers aboard, partly because they like the company, but mostly because it annoys the Vogons, which is exactly the sort of thing you need to know if you're an impoverished hitchhiker trying to see the marvels of the universe for less than 30 Altarian dollars a day. And that's my job. Fun, isn't it? Arthur looked lost. It's amazing, he said, and frowned at one of the other mattresses. Unfortunately, I got stuck on the Earth for rather longer than I intended, said Ford. I came for a week and got stuck for 15 years. But how did you get there in the first place, then? Easy, I got to live with a teaser. A teaser? Yeah. Uh, what is a teaser? Teasers are usually rich kids with nothing to do. They cruise around looking for planets that haven't made interstellar contact yet and buzz them. Buzz them? Arthur began to feel that Ford was enjoying making life difficult for him. Yeah, said Ford. They buzz them. They find some poor, isolated spot with very few people around, then they land right by some poor, unsuspecting soul whom no one's ever going to believe, and then strut up and down in front of him wearing silly antennae on their heads and making beep beep noises. Rather childish, really. Ford leaned back on the mattress with his hands behind his head and looked infuriatingly pleased with himself. Ford, insisted Arthur, I don't know if this sounds like a silly question, but what am I doing here? Well, you know that, said Ford. I rescued you from the Earth. And what's happened to the Earth? Ah, it's been, demolished. Has it? Said Arthur levelly. Yes, it just boiled away into space. Look, said Arthur, I'm a bit upset about that. Ford frowned to himself and seemed to roll the thought around in his mind. Yes, I can understand that, he said at last. Understand that? Shouted Arthur. Understand that? Ford sprang up. Keep looking at the book, he hissed urgently. What? Don't panic. I'm not panicking. Yes, you are. All right, so I'm panicking. What else is there to do? You just come along with me and have a good time. The galaxy's a fun place. You'll need to have this fish in your ear. I beg your pardon, asked Arthur, rather politely, he thought. Ford was holding up a small glass jar, which, quite clearly, had a small yellow fish wriggling around in it. Arthur blinked at him. He wished there was something simple and recognizable he could grasp hold of. He would have felt safe if, alongside the Dentrassi's underwear, the piles of squanchulous mattresses, and the man from Beetlejuice holding up a small yellow fish and offering to put it in his ear, had been able to see just a small packet of cornflakes. But he couldn't, and he didn't feel safe. Suddenly, a violent noise leaped at them from no source that he could identify. He gasped in terror at what sounded like a man trying to gargle while fighting off a pack of wolves. Shush, said Arthur. Listen, it might be important. Important? It's the Vogon captain making an announcement on the tannoy. You mean that's how the Vogons talk? Listen, but I can't speak Vogon. You don't need to. Just put this fish in your ear. Ford, with a lightning movement, clapped his hand to Arthur's ear, and he had the sudden sickening sensation of the fish slithering deep into his oral tract. Gasping with horror, he scrabbled at his ear for a second or so, but then slowly turned goggle-eyed with wonder. He was experiencing the oral equivalent of looking at a picture of two black silhouetted faces, and suddenly seeing it as a picture of a white candlestick, or of looking at a lot of colored dots on a piece of paper, which suddenly resolve themselves into the figure 6 and mean that your optician is going to charge you a lot of money for a new pair of glasses. He was still listening to the howling gargles, he knew that, only now it had somehow taken on the semblance of perfectly straightforward English. This is what he heard. One second. Chapter 6. Should have a good time. I'm not kidding, that's actually more or less what it says. Message repeats, "This is your captain speaking, so stop whatever you're doing and pay attention. First of all, I see from our instruments that we have a couple of hitchhikers aboard. Hello, wherever you are. I just want to make it totally clear that you are not at all welcome. I worked hard to get where I am today, and I didn't become captain of a Vogon constructor ship simply so I could turn it into a taxi service for a load of degenerate freeloaders. I have sent out a search party, and as soon as they find you, I will put you off the ship. If you're very lucky, I might read you some of my poetry first. Secondly, we're about to jump into hyperspace for the journey to Barnard's Star. On arrival, we will stay in dock for a 72-hour refit, and no one's to leave the ship during that time. I repeat, all planet leave is cancelled. I've just had an unhappy love affair, so I don't see why anyone else should have a good time. Message ends." The noise stopped. Arthur discovered to his embarrassment that he was lying curled up in a small ball on the floor with his arms wrapped around his head. He smiled weakly. "Charming man," he said. "I wish I had a daughter so I could forbid her to marry one." "You wouldn't need to," said Ford. They've got as much sex appeal as a road accident. No, don't move," he added as Arthur began to uncurl himself. "You'd better be prepared for the jump into hyperspace. It's unpleasantly like being drunk." "What's so unpleasant about being drunk?" "You ask a glass of water." Arthur thought about this. "Ford," he said. "Yeah? What's this fish doing in my ear?" "It's translating for you. It's a Babel fish. Look it up in the book if you like." He tossed over The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, then curled himself up into a fetal ball to prepare himself for the jump. At that moment, the bottom fell out of Arthur's mind. His eyes turned inside out. His feet began to leak out of the top of his head. The room folded flat around him, spun around, shifted out of existence, and left him sliding into his own navel. They were passing through hyperspace. "The Babel fish," said The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy quietly, "is small, yellow, and leech-like, and probably the oddest thing in the universe. It feeds on brainwave energy received not from its own carrier, but from those around it. It absorbs all unconscious mental frequencies from this brainwave energy to nourish itself with. It then excretes into the mind of its carrier a telepathic matrix formed by combining the conscious thought frequencies with nerve signals picked up from the speech centers of the brain which has supplied them. The practical upshot of all of that is that if you stick a babelfish in your ear, you can instantly understand anything said to you in any form of language. The speech patterns you actually hear decode the brainwave matrix which has been fed into your mind by your babelfish. Now, it is such a bizarrely improbable coincidence that anything so mind-bogglingly useful could have evolved purely by chance that some thinkers have chosen to see it as a final and clinching proof of the non-existence of God. The argument goes something like this. "I refuse to prove that I exist," says God, "for proof denies faith, and without faith I am nothing." "But," says man, "the babelfish is a dead giveaway, isn't it? It could not have evolved by chance. It proves you exist, and so therefore, by your own arguments, you don't. QED. "Oh dear," says God, "I hadn't thought of that," and promptly vanishes in a puff of logic. "Oh, that was easy," says man, and for an encore goes on to prove that black is white and gets himself killed in the next zebra crossing. Most leading theologians claim that this argument is a load of dingo's kidneys, but that didn't stop Ulan Khulufid making a small fortune when he used it as the central theme of his best-selling book. Well, that about wraps it up for God. Meanwhile, the poor babelfish, by effectively removing all barriers to communication between different races and cultures, has caused more and bloodier wars than anything else in the history of creation. Arthur let out a low groan. He was horrified to discover that the kick through hyperspace hadn't killed him. He was now 6 light-years from the place that Earth would have been if it still existed. The Earth. Visions of it swam sickeningly through his nauseated mind. There was no way his imagination could feel the impact of the whole Earth having gone. It was too big. He prodded his feelings by thinking about his parents or thinking that his parents and his sister had gone. No reaction. He thought of all the people he had been close to. No reaction. Then he thought of a complete stranger he had been standing behind in the queue at the supermarket 2 days before, and felt a sudden stab. The supermarket was gone. Everyone in it was gone. Nelson's column had gone. Nelson's column had gone, and there would be no outcry, because there was no one left to make an outcry. From now on, Nelson's column only existed in his mind. England only existed in his mind. His mind, stuck here in this dank, smelly, steel-lined spaceship. A wave of claustrophobia closed in on him. England no longer existed. He'd got that. Somehow he'd got it. He tried again. America, he thought, has gone. He couldn't grasp it. He decided to start smaller again. New York has gone. No reaction. He'd never seriously believed it existed anyway. The dollar, he thought, has sunk forever. Slight tremor there. Every Bogart movie has been wiped, he said to himself, and that gave him a nasty knock. McDonald's, he thought. There is no longer any such thing as a McDonald's hamburger. He passed out. When he came round a second later, he found he was sobbing for his mother. He jerked himself violently to his feet. Ford! Ford looked up from where he was sitting in a corner, humming to himself. He always found the actual traveling through space part of space travel rather trying. Yeah, he said. If you're a researcher on this book thing and you were on Earth, you must have been gathering material on it. Yes, I was able to extend the original entry a bit, yes. Let me see what it has to say in this edition, then. I've got to see it. Yeah, okay. He passed it over again. Arthur grabbed hold of it and tried to stop his hands shaking. He pressed the entry for the relevant page. The screen flashed and swirled and resolved into a page of print. Arthur stared at it. It doesn't have an entry, he burst out. Ford looked over his shoulder. Yes, it does, he said. Down there, see at the bottom of the screen. Just above Eccentrica Galumbits, the triple-breasted whore of Eroticon 6. Arthur followed Ford's finger and saw where it was pointing. For a moment, it still didn't register. Then his mind nearly blew up. What? Harmless? Is that all it's got to say? Harmless? One word? Ford shrugged. Well, there are 100 billion stars in the galaxy and only a limited amount of space in the book's microprocessors, he said. And no one knew much about the Earth, of course. Well, for God's sake, I hope you managed to rectify that a bit. Oh, yes, well, I managed to transmit a new entry off to the editor. He had to trim it a bit, but it's still an improvement. What does it say now? Asked Arthur. Mostly harmless, admitted Ford with a slightly embarrassed cough. Mostly harmless, shouted Arthur. What was that noise? Shouted, sorry, getting myself mixed up on these. What was that noise? Hissed Ford. It was me, shouting, shouted Arthur. No, shut up, said Ford. I think we're in trouble. You think we're in trouble? Outside the door were the clear sounds of marching footsteps. The Dentressies? Whispered Arthur. No, those are steel-tipped boots, said Ford. There was a sharp ringing rap on the door. Then who is it? Said Arthur. Well, said Ford, if we're lucky, it's just the Vogons come to throw us into space. And if we're unlucky? If we're unlucky, said Ford grimly, the captain might be serious in his threat that he's going to read us some of his poetry first. We'll get back to this in just a minute. I'm going to rehydrate. Someone on TikTok commented, don't forget your towels, folks. Yes. I forget whether or not the book mentioned the thing about towels already, but yeah, chapter 3. That's still one of my favorite bits, the idea that the towel is the most incomprehensibly useful item you can carry when doing something ridiculous like hitchhiking across the galaxy. Well, let's see. How long is this one? Okay. Well, we got time for one more chapter, so we will carry on with chapter 7, and then we will call it a day. Let's see. Chapter 7. Vogon poetry is, of course, the third worst in the universe. The second worst is that of the Asgoths of Krea. During a recitation by their poet master, Grunthos the Flatulent, of his poem, Ode to a Small Lump of Green Putty I Found in My Armpit One Midsummer Morning, 4 of his audience died of internal hemorrhaging, and the president of the Midgalactic Arts Nobbling Council survived by gnawing off one of his own legs. Grunthos is reported to have been disappointed by the poem's reception and was about to embark on a reading of his 12-book epic entitled My Favorite Bath Time Gurgles, when his own major intestine, in a desperate attempt to save life and civilization, leapt straight up through his neck and throttled his brain. The very worst poetry of all perished along with its creator, Paula Nancy Millstone Jennings of Greenbridge, Essex, England, in the destruction of the planet Earth. Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz smiled very slowly. This was done not so much for effect as because he was trying to remember the sequence of muscle movements. He had a terribly therapeutic yell at his prisoners and was now feeling quite relaxed, and ready for a little callousness. The prisoners sat in poetry appreciation chairs, strapped in. Vogons suffered no illusions as to the regard their works were generally held in. Their early attempts at composition had been part of a bludgeoning insistence that they be accepted as a properly evolved and cultured race. But now the only thing that kept them going was sheer bloody-mindedness. The sweat stood out cold on Ford Prefect's brow and slid round the electrodes strapped to his temples. These were attached to a battery of electronic equipment: imagery intensifiers, rhythmic modulators, alliterative residulators, and simile dumpers, all designed to heighten the experience of the poem and make sure that not a single nuance of the poet's thought was lost. Arthur Dent sat and quivered. He had no idea what he was in for, but he knew that he hadn't liked anything that had happened so far, and didn't think things were likely to change. The Vogon began to read, a fetid little passage of his own devising. "Oh, Freddled Gruntbugley," he began. Spasms racked Ford's body. This was worse than even he'd been prepared for. "Thy micturations are to me as Plurdled Glabberbrochets in a lurgid bee." "Ah!" went Ford Prefect, wrenching his head back as lumps of pain thumped through it. He could dimly see beside him Arthur lolling and rolling in his seat. He clenched his teeth. "Group, I implore thee," continued the merciless Vogon, "my foonting turling drones." His voice was rising to a horrible pitch of impassioned stridency. "And hooptiously drangle me with crinkly bindle wordles, or I will rend thee in the gobblewarts with my blurgle crunch and see if I don't." cried Ford Prefect, and threw one final spasm as the electronic enhancement to the last line caught him full blast across the temples. He went limp. Arthur lolled. "Now, Earthlings," whirred the Vogon. He didn't know that Ford Prefect was in fact from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Betelgeuse, and wouldn't have cared if he had. "I present you with a simple choice. Either die in the vacuum of space, or—" He paused for melodramatic effect. "Tell me how good you thought my poem was." He threw himself backwards into a huge, leathery, bat-shaped seat and watched them. He did the smile again. Ford was rasping for breath. He rolled his dusty tongue round his parched mouth and moaned. Arthur said brightly, "Actually, I quite liked it." Ford turned and gaped. Here was an approach that had quite simply not occurred to him. The Vogon raised a surprised eyebrow that effectively obscured his nose and was therefore no bad thing. "Oh, good," he whirred, in considerable astonishment. Oh, yes, said Arthur. I thought that some of the metaphysical imagery was particularly effective. Ford continued to stare at him, slowly organizing his thoughts around this totally new concept. Were they really going to be able to bareface their way out of this? Yes, do continue, invited the Vogon. Oh, and, interesting rhythmic devices, too, continued Arthur, which seemed to counterpoint the, he floundered. Ford leapt to his rescue, hazarding, counterpoint the surrealism of the underlying metaphor of the, he floundered too, but Arthur was ready again. Humanity of the vogonity, Ford hissed at him. Ah, yes, vogonity, sorry, of the poet's compassionate soul. Arthur felt he was on a home stretch now, which contrives through the medium of the verse structure to sublimate this, transcend that, and come to terms with the fundamental dichotomies of the other. He was reaching a triumphant crescendo, and one is left with a profound and vivid insight into, which suddenly gave out on him. Ford leapt in with the coup de grace. Into whatever it was that the poem was about, he yelled, out of the corner of his mouth. Well done, Arthur, that was very good. The Vogon perused them. For a moment, his embittered racial soul had been touched. But he thought, no, too little, too late. His voice took on the quality of a cat snagging brushed nylon. So, what you're saying is that I write poetry because underneath my mean, callous, artless exterior, I really just want to be loved, he said. He paused. Is that right? Ford laughed a nervous laugh. Well, I mean, yes, he said. Don't we all, deep down, The Vogon stood up. No, well, you're completely wrong, he said. I just write poetry to throw my mean, callous, heartless exterior into sharp relief. I'm going to throw you off the ship anyway. Guard! Take the prisoners to number 3 airlock and throw them out. What? Shouted Ford. A huge young Vogon guard stepped forward and yanked them out of their straps with his huge, blubbery arms. You can't throw us into space, yelled Ford. We're trying to write a book. Resistance is useless, shouted the Vogon guard back at him. It was the first phrase he'd learned when he joined the Vogon Guard Corps. The captain watched with detached amusement and then turned away. Arthur stared round him wildly. I don't want to die now, he yelled. I've still got a headache. I don't want to go to heaven with a headache. I'd be all cross and wouldn't enjoy it. The guard grasped them firmly round the neck, and bowing deferentially toward his captain's back, hoiked them both protesting out of the bridge. A steel door closed, and the captain was once again on his own. He hummed quietly and mused to himself, lightly fingering his notebook of verses. He said. Counterpoint the surrealism of the underlying metaphor. He considered this for a moment, then closed the book with a grim smile. Death's too good for them, he said. The long, steel-lined corridor echoed to the feeble struggles of the two humanoids clamped firmly under rubbery Vogon armpits. This is great, spluttered Arthur. This is really terrific. Let go of me, you brute! The Vogon guard dragged them on. Don't you worry, said Ford. I'll think of something. He didn't sound hopeful. Resistance is useless, bellowed the guard. Just don't say things like that, stammered Ford. How can anyone maintain a positive mental attitude if you're going to say things like that? My God, complained Arthur. You're talking about a positive mental attitude and you haven't even had your planet demolished today. I woke up this morning and thought I'd have a nice, relaxed day, do a bit of reading, brush the dog. It's now just after 4 in the afternoon, and I'm already being thrown out of an alien spaceship 6 light years from the smoking remains of the Earth. He spluttered and gurgled as the Vogon tightened his grip. All right, said Ford, just stop panicking. Who said anything about panicking? Snapped Arthur. This is all still just the culture shock. You wait till I've settled down into the situation and found my bearings. Then I'll start panicking. Arthur, you're getting hysterical. Shut up. Ford tried desperately to think, but was interrupted by the guard shouting again. Resistance is useless! And you can shut up as well, snapped Ford. Resistance is useless! Oh, give it a rest, said Ford. He twisted his head till he was looking straight up into his captor's face. A thought struck him. Do you really enjoy this sort of thing? He asked suddenly. The Vogon stopped dead, and a look of immense stupidity seeped slowly over his face. Enjoy? He boomed. What do you mean? What I mean, said Ford, is does it give you a full, satisfying life? Stomping around, shouting, pushing people out of spaceships? The Vogon stared up at the low steel ceiling, and his eyebrows almost rolled over each other. His mouth slacked. Finally, he said, Well, the hours are good. They'd have to be, agreed Ford. Arthur twisted his head round to look at Ford. Ford, what are you doing? He asked in an amazed whisper. Oh, just try to take an interest in the world around me, okay? He said. So the hours are pretty good then. He resumed. The Vogon stared down at him as sluggish thoughts moiled around in the murky depths. Yeah, he said. But now you come to mention it, most of the actual minutes are pretty lousy. Except, he thought again, which required looking at the ceiling. Except some of the shouting I quite like. He filled his lungs and bellowed, Resistance is... Sure, yes, interrupted Ford hurriedly. You're good at that, I can tell. But if it's mostly lousy, he said, slowly giving the words time to reach their mark, then why do you do it? What is it? The girls? The leather? The machismo? Or do you just find that coming to terms with the mindless tedium of it all presents an interesting challenge? Arthur looked backward and forward between them in bafflement. Said the guard. Uh, I don't know. I think I just sort of do it, really. My aunt said that spaceship guard was a good career for a young Vogon. You know, the uniform, the low-slung sunray holster, the mindless tedium. There you are, Arthur, said Ford with the air of someone reaching the conclusion of his argument. You think you've got problems. Arthur rather thought he had. Apart from the unpleasant business with his home planet, the Vogon guard had half-throttled him already, and he didn't like the sound of being thrown into space very much. Try and understand his problem, insisted Ford. Here he is, poor lad. His entire life's work is stamping around, throwing people off of spaceships, and shouting, added the guard. And shouting, sure, said Ford, patting the blubbery arm clamped round his neck in friendly condescension. And he doesn't even know why he's doing it. Arthur agreed this was very sad. He did this with a small feeble gesture because he was too asphyxiated to speak. Deep rumblings of bemusement came from the guard. Well, now you put it like that, I suppose. Good lad, encouraged Ford. But all right, went on the rumblings. So what's the alternative? Well, said Ford, brightly, but slowly, stop doing it, of course. Tell them, he went on, you're not going to do it any more. He felt he ought to add something to that, but for the moment the guard seemed to have his mind occupied pondering that much. Said the guard. Well, that doesn't sound that great to me. Ford suddenly felt the moment slipping away. Now, wait a minute, he said. That's just the start, you see. There's more to it than that, you see. But at that moment, the guard renewed his grip and continued his original purpose of lugging his prisoners to the airlock. He was obviously quite touched. No, I think if it's all the same to you, I'd better just get you both shoved into this airlock and then go and get on with some other bits of shouting I've got to do. It wasn't all the same to Ford Prefect at all. Come on now, but look, he said less slowly, less brightly. Said Arthur without any clear inflection. But hang on, pursued Ford. There's music and art and things to tell you about. Resistance is useless, bellowed the guard, and then added, You see, if I keep it up, I can eventually get promoted to senior shouting officer. And there aren't really usually many vacancies for non-shouting and non-pushing people about officers, so I think I better stick to what I know. They had now reached the airlock. A large circular steel hatchway of massive strength and weight let into the inner skin of the craft. The guard operated a control, and the hatchway swung smoothly open. But thanks for taking an interest, said the Vogon guard. Bye now. He flung Ford and Arthur through the hatchway into the small chamber within. Arthur lay panting for breath. Ford scrambled round and flung his shoulder uselessly against the reclosing hatchway. But listen, he shouted to the guard. There's a whole world you don't know anything about. Here, how about this? Desperately, he grabbed for the only bit of culture he knew offhand. He hummed the first bar of Beethoven's Fifth. Da-da-da-dum! Doesn't that stir anything in you? No, said the guard. Not really. But I'll mention it to my aunt. If he said anything further after that, it was lost. The hatchway sealed itself tight, and all sound was lost except the faint, distant hum of the ship's engines. Uh, They were in a brightly polished cylindrical chamber about 6 feet in diameter and 10 feet long. Ford looked round it, panting. Potentially bright lad, I thought, he said, and slumped against the curved wall. Arthur was still lying in the curve of the floor where he had fallen. He didn't look up. He just lay, panting. We're trapped now, aren't we? Yes, said Ford. We're trapped. Well, didn't you think of anything? I thought you said you were going to think of something. Perhaps you thought of something and I didn't notice. Oh, yes, I thought of something, panted Ford. Arthur looked up expectantly. But, unfortunately, continued Ford, it rather involved being on the other side of this airtight hatchway. He kicked the hatch they'd just been thrown through. But it was a good idea, was it? Oh, yes, very neat. What was it? Well, I hadn't worked out the details yet. Not much point now, is there? So, what happens next? Asked Arthur. Oh, well, the hatchway in front of us will open automatically in a few moments, and we will shoot out into deep space, I expect, and asphyxiate. If you take a lungful of air with you, you can last for up to 30 seconds, of course, said Ford. He struck his hands behind his back, raised his eyebrows, and started to hum an old Beetlejuicean battle hymn. To Arthur's eyes, he suddenly looked very alien. So this is it, said Arthur. We're going to die. Yes, said Ford. Except, no! Wait a minute! He suddenly lunged across the chamber at something behind Arthur's line of vision. What's this switch? He cried. What? Where? Cried Arthur, twisting round. No, I was only fooling, said Ford. We are going to die after all. He slumped against the wall again, and carried on the tune from where he left off. You know, said Arthur, it's at times like this, when I'm trapped in a Vogon airlock with a man from Beetlejuice and about to die of asphyxiation in deep space, that I really wish I'd listened to what my mother told me when I was young. Why? What did she tell you? I don't know. I didn't listen. Oh, said Ford, and carried on humming. This is terrific, Arthur thought to himself. Nelson's column is gone, MacDonald's is gone. All that's left is me and the words mostly harmless. Any second now, all that will be left is mostly harmless. And yesterday the planet seemed to be going so well. A motor whirred. A slight hiss built into a deafening roar of rushing air as the outer hatchway opened onto an empty blackness studded with tiny, impossibly bright points of light. Ford and Arthur popped into outer space like corks from a toy gun. And that's where we're going to stop for this week. Barring any unforeseen incidents, I will be back next Saturday to carry on. I hope everyone has enjoyed this run with with these chapters of the Hitchhiker's Guide, and yeah, we'll see you guys next week. Bye.